As discussed in the second episode, the doctrine of the papacy has several major components that build off of each other, each with distinct historical developments and difficulties. The combination of those beliefs created the concept of the papacy as it developed through the early Middle Ages all the way into the 18th and 19th centuries. This episode will address the later and more dramatic claims about papal authority, some of which did not reach their fully fledged modern formulation until the First Vatican Council convened in 1869. The Bishop of Rome now claims total supremacy over the entire church, anywhere and any time without appeal, including individual superiority over all church councils, as well as the ability to teach infallibly without error. This might seem passé to modern Roman Catholics, but to both Protestants and Orthodox, and many generations of past Roman Catholics through the centuries, these claims are absolutely mind-boggling. Sometimes Catholics recognize that this is foreign to much of church history, but claim that the current papacy is the natural, logical outworking of what was established by Christ. But for non-Catholics, they are some of the most blatant modern innovations on an already overly empowered Roman bishopric, innovations often based on forgeries and old-school political power grabs. I myself believe that these teachings are among the strongest reasons to reject Roman Catholicism. Papal supremacy and infallibility. For the sake of clarity, it's necessary to define these claims according to official sources recognized by contemporary Catholics. Let's start off with papal supremacy. According to Vatican I, Roman primacy is not simply one of convention, of honor, or even of ecclesiastical appeal, though it includes those. It is one of supremacy, in which the Pope has fullness of power with universal, ordinary, and immediate jurisdiction over the entire Church. Superiority over church councils. The teachings of councils, including ecumenical councils, have no authority unless the Pope, as their authoritative head, recognizes their decisions. The Pope has functional and total veto power. Much of the medieval Catholic Church passionately battled against this, and it's also really hated by the Eastern Orthodox. The battle over conciliar power was not won by Rome until the 16th century in the Fifth Lateran Council. Infallibility. The Pope claims an infallible teaching authority under the circumstances that he solemnly, in virtue of his office, defines a doctrine concerning faith and morals to be held by the whole Church. This arguably first appeared in the 12th or 13th centuries, but it wasn't finally dogmatized until Vatican I in 1870. Supreme power over all earthly rulers. It's also worth noting some claims were once made by Rome that later fell out of favor outside of ultra-trad circles. At one point in the Middle Ages, the Pope taught that all authorities on earth, including governments, derived their legitimacy from his recognition. This extreme view was most famously declared by Pope Boniface VIII in 1302 in the bull Unam Sanctam, because at the time he was in a power struggle with King Philip IV of France. Functionally, the Pope declared that he had the ability to void governments or dissolve the legitimacy of nation-states. Salvation is dependent on submission to the Pope. Numerous past popes claimed, authoritatively according to them, that submission to papal jurisdiction was a necessary prerequisite to salvation. In the same bull, Unam Sanctam, arguably matching Vatican I's criteria for an infallible statement, Pope Boniface decreed, "We declare, say, define, and pronounce that it is absolutely necessary for the salvation of every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff." Protestants, of course, find this claim to be ludicrous and even antichrist. In his own lifetime, Peter did not hold such messianic authority over the salvation of any individual. In fact, Paul put Peter on blast for being too friendly towards those who were adding extra steps to salvation. Why on earth would Peter's alleged spiritual heirs wield more power than he ever did? The historical narrative of how these claims developed is very complex, and a short video is far from enough space to do justice to the full history. But a key takeaway from the historical data is that this sort of authority was simply never recognized universally by the early church. Even as ideas of the apostolic succession of bishops became entrenched, and Rome's associations with Peter and Paul grew in importance for the Roman bishop's self-conception, there was never a received consensus on a universal Roman authority. Eastern churches would recognize a primacy of honor or even of judicial appeal, which which is established in the Council of Serdica in 341, but never authority to intervene in their affairs at will. Once you get to the 4th and 5th centuries in the Latin West, you start to have ideas like this take root. And if we look at the first 1,000 years of church history, basically the later you go, the larger the claims made by Rome, and the more likely it is that Western bishops recognize them. But regarding the geographic dimension of the primacy of Rome that developed, scholar J.N.D. Kelly puts it well. The crucial question, however, is whether or not this undoubted primacy of honor was held to exist by divine right and so to involve an overriding jurisdiction. So far as the East is concerned, the answer must be, by and large, in the negative. While showing it immense deference and setting great store by its pronouncements, the Eastern churches never treated Rome as the constitutional center and head of the church, much less as an infallible oracle on faith and morals, and on occasion had not the least compunction about resisting its express will. And of course, every Protestant branch downstream of the Reformation absolutely denounced such claims. A high-altitude look at the growth of the papacy. While understanding that a flyover of so much history will inevitably leave some gaps or oversimplify some centuries here and there, it remains valuable to step back and assess the growth of the papacy from 10,000 feet. So let's start at the beginning. By the end of the 2nd century, it's undisputed that Rome had fully transitioned from a rule of a group of presbyters, aka bishops, to a singular bishop over the entire city. As Rome was a socio-political power center with centuries of momentum, the Bishop of Rome quickly became an important and influential man involved in the affairs of the broader church, often being an important defender of orthodoxy against heresy. Church fathers like Irenaeus happily stated that everyone ought to look to Rome for guidance on doctrinal issues given its historic roots and stability. Yet this was nothing absolute. We see other bishops were comfortable ignoring the Roman bishop's wishes. The first Roman bishop we know to have attempted to meddle officially in the affairs of Eastern bishops was Victor I. Around 190 AD, Victor I tried to sever communion with bishops in Asia Minor for celebrating Easter on Passover, regardless of whether it fell on a Sunday or not. Not only did these Asian bishops completely disregard Victor, Eusebius notes that a bunch of bishops, including Irenaeus, issued a very stern rebuke of Victor's meddling. Throughout the 3rd century, Rome was racked by schism internally and externally while experiencing significant persecution, even having communion severed with African and Eastern churches. While granting Rome much respect, other parts of the church felt no need to obey Roman wishes. In fact, they felt free to rebuke Rome over disagreements. In 256, Cyprian of Carthage called a synod in which 87 bishops solemnly repudiated Stephen of Rome's teaching on accepting heretical baptisms. The question isn't whether Cyprian or Stephen was right in that dispute. The point is that Cyprian and his allies took issue with Stephen appealing to a special authority that he claimed he had derived from Peter. As the Orthodox scholar Siecienski notes, this is why Cyprian reminded him that Peter, whom the Lord chose first and upon whom he built his church, never showed any arrogant pretensions or made any special claims for himself. He didn't assert that he had rights of seniority and that therefore upstarts and latecomers ought to be obedient to him. Cyprian railed against anyone who presumed to set himself up as a bishop of bishops, and by tyrannical terror force his colleagues to a necessity of obeying. In 306, Emperor Constantine came to the throne, a fateful reign for the history of the church. He famously convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 after legalizing Christianity, and we can see in the official canons of the council that the government of regional churches was crystallizing under regional patriarchates. The bishops of Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem each had their own jurisdiction, largely mirroring the hierarchy of the political Roman provincial system. In Canon 6 of that council, we find this decree. The ancient custom should prevail in Egypt and Libya and Pentopolis that the Bishop of Alexandria should have authority over all these, since the same is the custom with the Roman bishop himself. Here we can see that Alexandria, according to custom, was to have authority over Egypt and Libya just as Rome did over its surrounding areas, reflecting how Rome both was quick in its consolidation of power in the West and how the patriarchates were seen as having distinct and parallel jurisdictions. At the end of Constantine's reign, he moved to the imperial capital from Rome to Constantinople, and the Bishop of Constantinople rapidly gained power in the church, much to Rome's chagrin. After Constantine's death, the Council of Serdica was held in 343 in what is now modern Bulgaria. It was meant to be an ecumenical council, but ended up being an abysmal failure. However, it very importantly established a Roman appellate jurisdiction for the trials of bishops, where bishops could appeal regional disciplinary decisions to Rome as a last resort. However, it's the reign of Pope Damasus 20 years later, from 366 to 384, that some have described as the first definite self-expression of the papacy. Damasus was the pope who spurred Jerome to translate the Vulgate, and was also the first recorded person to use the term the Apostolic See as a unique reference to Rome and its authority. Remember, this comes a full 300 years after the death of Peter. In 381, the Council of Constantinople was held in the east, and in 382, Damasus presided over a synod that rebuffed some of the canonical reasoning of Constantinople, asserting that Rome's position was not set up by synods, but derived its authority and establishment directly from the apostles Peter and Paul. This wasn't the first time people had spoken this way, but it was the first time it entered official Roman theology, again more than 3 centuries after the deaths of Peter and Paul, the difference between Louis XIV of France and Ronald Reagan. Damasus' successor Siricius, who reigned from 384 to 399, was the author of the first indisputable decretal, a type of letter that was politically modeled on the Roman imperial decree and which would become foundational to Western canon law. This decretal further developed Petrine succession language and exegesis backing Rome's unique authority. The 5th century was a turbulent one for Rome. The Visigoth king Alaric sacked Rome in 410, and the papacy, through its newfound system of decretals, communicated with the disintegrating Western Empire, providing needed central leadership at home and abroad. Controversies racked the church, leading to the councils of Ephesus in 431 and Chalcedon in 451, with popes being important players. Like Chalcedon, in the aftermath of this political chaos, we can really see that the fault lines between East and West had already been set more intractably than Constantinople won. In Canon 28 of Chalcedon, the Council Fathers directly rejected the idea of an inherent Roman primacy, reiterating the decree from the Council of Constantinople saying that Roman privilege had been awarded to it on the basis of being the center of imperial power, not based on unique apostolic authority. Thus, the new imperial city of Constantinople expected the same treatment. Rightly have the Fathers conceded to the See of Old Rome its privileges on account of its character as the imperial city, and moved by the same considerations, the 150 bishops have awarded the like privileges to the most holy See of New Rome, judging with good reason that the city which is honored by the imperial power in the Senate, and which enjoys the same privileges as the ancient imperial city, should also in its ecclesiastical relations be exalted and hold the second place after that. Pope Leo naturally objected. While recognizing the doctrinal decisions of that council, he rejected Canon 28 while invoking the Apostle Peter's authority. By the blessed Apostle Peter's authority, we absolutely disannul the canon in comprehensive terms. The East paid no heed to Rome's protest and continued to operate in accordance with the council's decision, while Rome continued to consolidate its power and clarify its claims in the West. The political position of the Pope continued to be crucial. Leo, called the Great, was a Roman aristocrat and patriot deeply devoted to his city. In addition to fighting with Chalcedon, he famously persuaded Attila the Hun to turn back from his invasion of Italy in 452, helping preserve Roman civic identity. In this swirl of ecclesiastical and political chaos, the papacy started to truly come into its own. The good, the bad, and the ugly. The ascent of the papacy has its share of true heroism as well as its share of villainy in this chaos. It would take another 600 years until anyone began making claims about Roman authority that were expansive enough to rival Vatican I in 1870. Before going on, some distinctions are now in order. As has come up already, after the First Ecumenical Councils, disputes over canon law become central to the story. Canon law is the set of laws and ordinances that were instituted for the governance of the Church, with each local synod and general council normally issuing a list of canons or rules for their own governance. Canon lawyers and theologians were distinct groups that often operated somewhat separately from each other, especially as the church developed into an even larger and more elaborate organization after becoming the official religion of the empire. Theological arguments became political struggles, and political struggles became theological arguments. And fights over canon law and forgeries being successfully added to canon law are an integral part of the story of how the papacy transitioned from late antiquity to the Middle Ages. An important early example of forgery happened during the Laurentian Schism, when in the 6th century two men, Symmachus and Laurentius, both claimed the position of pope and split the clergy. Partisans of Symmachus forged 11 documents which were taken as genuine, and after being circulated in official canonical collections greatly affected canon law to this day. One of the main points of the faux collections is the principle called prima sedes a nemine judicatur, meaning the first seat is judged by no one. For centuries, those forgeries successfully established false canonical precedent that no ecclesiastical mechanism had the authority to judge the Pope, and that was a cornerstone in building the medieval papacy. But the largest and most influential body of forgeries would come hundreds of years later in the 9th century in a collection called the Pseudo-Isidorian corpus. They seem to have originated from a monastery in the West during the reign of Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's son. And the author, or authors, was an incredibly erudite and talented forger who desired to expand the clergy's power over against local rulers. A big part of this was expanding papal privileges at the expense of local governments. The collection was accepted as authentic by almost everyone for more than 4 centuries and became interwoven with the most prestigious collections of canon law, playing a crucial role in the expansion of papal power in the investiture controversy, which straddled the 11th and 12th centuries. There were 3 main parts to the Pseudo-Isidorian corpus, the first of which was entirely fraudulent, second mostly authentic, and the third mixed together. The first was particularly brazen, and fabricated a history of papal teaching to infill the first 3 centuries of church history with Roman power and influence. As scholar Clara Harder notes, Part 1 begins with some preliminary texts including the important foreword by the supposed author Isidorus Mercator. There follows a collection of 60 decretals by bishops of Rome from Anacletus to Miltiades. All of these papal decretals are false. Indeed, there are no surviving authentic letters from any of these bishops of Rome. This was a bold and unparalleled project, the forging of documents by no less than 29 successive popes. The second part of the collection contained the donation of Constantine, which claimed that Constantine had given Pope Sylvester title to the entire western half of the empire. This was important for the Pope's political claims on the papal states throughout the Middle Ages, helping make the Pope a secular head of state to this day. Harder also notes that the authority of Rome over the universal church was an important topic in the collection as well. She explains how the forger put forward the ideas that A. Only the Bishop of Rome can summon a church council. B. A council held without the approval of the Pope is invalid. C. Not only must the council be summoned by the Bishop of Rome, but his legates also have the right to preside over it, and all the council's decisions require the Pope's approval. D. The Pope is responsible for all important matters of the Church, which include everything that concerns the higher clergy. E. Bishops who are being prosecuted locally may appeal to the Pope, who has the power not only to protect them, but also to revoke any conviction determined by any council, and to reinstate bishops who had been convicted. F. The Pope can terminate any proceedings against any accused bishop if he so pleases. And most importantly, no authority within or outside the Church can prevail over the verdict of the Apostolic See in Rome. These forgeries permeated the most prestigious canonical collections in the West for centuries, including Gratian's Decretum and others. Literally all canon lawyers relied on them. It's hard to overestimate the effect of such a successful deception that ended up being so systemic and universal in the medieval Latin Church, providing a completely fraudulent view of the Church up through the 4th century and a wildly inaccurate view after that. The forgeries began to be rigorously questioned by John of Torquemada and Nicholas of Cusa in the 15th century, but they were only finally and decisively shown to be forgeries by a Calvinist minister in the 1600s. But by the time the forgeries were acknowledged as such, history was what it was, and immeasurable damage had been done to the trajectory of the Roman Church. Middle Ages. So, well before the Great Schism, canon lawyers and theologians in the West affirmed that the Pope had a fullness of power and supremacy. Indeed, these forgeries all took place before the schism. Yet it took a number of additional developments before there would be any claims of infallibility. Another important element of this, the High Middle Ages saw the founding and flourishing of mendicant, nomadic, povertyless, alms-begging orders of friars that completely transformed the religious landscape of the Latin West. It was an interesting cultural curveball that created new political frictions. Because, one, ordinary bishops and priests didn't like these friars infringing on their turf. And two, the lifestyle and theology of especially the Franciscans was suspect to many people. The friars, both the Dominicans and Franciscans, heavily relied on the papacy to protect them and legitimize their activities. And in turn, once they became an important theological force in the church, many started aggressively advancing papal interests. Scholar Brian Tierney says, "The point to be emphasized is the extraordinary dependence of the Franciscans on the papacy in the sphere of doctrine as well as the sphere of discipline." The difference can be seen between Bonaventure, the 13th century minister general of the Franciscans, and the theologians of Paris. Tierney observes, "For the secular masters, each bishop wielded an autonomous authority derived directly from Christ. Bonaventure suggested rather that bishops were more delegates or vicars of the Pope, just as parish priests were vicars of bishops. Father Yves Congar called Bonaventure the principal theoretician of papal monarchy in the 13th century. Though Bonaventure was crucial for the expansion of papal power, he never actually advanced a theory of papal infallibility. That was an honor that would fall to Pietro Olivi, another Franciscan, and it would be more than 600 years after this before this view became universal. The struggles against conciliarism in the 1300s and 1500s, Protestantism in the 1500s, Gallicanism in the 1600s and 1700s, and more still lay in the way, mostly concerning the relationship of Pope and Council. The Council of Constance, convoked in 1414, had deposed the three popes of the Papal Schism and reinstated a new pope. It affirmed conciliar authority in its documents, such as the decree Haec Sancta. In 1441, Pope Eugenius IV declared papal supremacy over councils in his bull Esse non dubatimus, and Dominican friars such as John of Torquemada aggressively advanced the papalist stance. France was the bastion of Gallicanism, the main continuation of conciliar theory after the Reformation, but lost its institutional foothold after the French Revolution, paving the way for the victory of the hyper-papalists in the 19th century. There isn't enough time in the day to cover the tangled history of the late medieval councils, conciliarism, and Gallicanism in any detail. It's probably some of the murkiest and most slippery history in Roman Catholicism, with some of the most important documents remaining untranslated. But these power struggles were an integral part of the road to Vatican I in 1870. Obviously, from a Protestant perspective, these extravagant claims by the papacy are deeply problematic historically and scripturally, both in their own right and because of how they causally underlie many of our other doctrinal differences. Given the historical weakness of Vatican I's claims, the entire system is a house of cards. It took, from a historical perspective, a very, very long time for the papacy to develop to the point where it was making such dramatic claims. Like a number of other Catholic doctrines, this is a classic case of slow accretions over time, where current claims are projected back onto periods where they would have been completely unheard of. The claim to universal immediate jurisdiction, the supposed relationship between popes and councils, and the claim to infallibility, they are simply not apostolic, and they are completely dependent on past imperial politics as well as forgeries. They are clearly not taught in Scripture, and at no point were they a universal belief of the early church. They are not a legitimate development of doctrine, nor a logical outgrowth of the deposit of faith. They are a major cause of schism.